Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Codi, for joining me. This is my first interview in a series, our Imagine Your Legacy series, today, tomorrow, and beyond. And I have some honorary guests, starting with the brilliant Codi Shewan, who has written this amazing book and given this fabulous talk about everyday legacy. And his book is Everyday Legacy for Living, Lessons for Living with Purpose Right Now. And our reason for having this series of talks, first of all, it's the introduction or the primer, if you will, for a webinar that we will be holding with charities so that we can have meaningful conversations about legacy, because legacy means different things to different people. And I think it's really important, and I know Codi agrees, and our other guests do as well, that it's so important for us to have conversations about legacy, because legacy means different things to different people. And so the subtitle of this series is Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond. So Codi is the perfect guest for us because his focus is on us living our legacy today. So I've asked Codi to start with answering the question, who and what has made a difference in his life when it comes to legacy? Why is Codi focusing on legacy? Because we all have people in our lives and experiences in our lives that inform us and impact us, that lead us to having a passion about legacy. So Codi, if you could share your story, that would be great.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks again so much for having me, Betty, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity from my perspective, to reframe the idea of legacy from something we leave to something we live every single day. And certainly the person who impacted my life probably the most would be my grandmother. And I've got a collection of stories from a collection of individuals that sort of have impressed on me the importance of legacy and living your legacy every single day. But she's someone to me that just, her values were crystallized in her character. People just knew who she was. She had sort of a quiet calm about her. She lived through the Second World War and came to Canada from England several years later. And really that life event really impacted how she showed up in life. She had a humility to her that was just really, really beautiful. She was, like, as I like to say, kindness personified. She was just such a loving spirit, and so many of the characteristics that she embodied, so many of the values that she had, ingrained in her, that were so embedded into her every single day, were impressed upon us as a family, and inevitably are values and characteristics that I hold dear today to my own character. And so she's just someone who I think is definitely probably one of the biggest influences in my life. She's with me all the time. There she is right there. She passed away several years ago. Dementia had different plans for her, but her spirit fought through right until the end. And she's someone who, there's probably not a day that goes by that I don't think about her.
That's wonderful. And I'm really glad you spoke to how there are certain values that resonate with us and for us, and family members who have had a very profound impact on us. So how does that relate to the book that you wrote?
So the book that I wrote, purposefully, when I wrote the book, I didn't want it to be prescriptive. It's funny because I got my first set of edits back, and the editor at the time had said, let's put in some examples. Maybe at the end we do sort of a Cole's notes of takeaways. And all of a sudden I just had this very feeling. I felt like I was all of a sudden turning into a textbook. And so I really wanted to use stories through my life, relationships that I had, and circumstances I found myself in my career, which I know we're going to get to in the next question. But really these lessons that were so powerfully present in my life. And I thought these really help to personify this idea of living your legacy every single day. Ultimately, yes, leaving a legacy, but how does it impact us and those around us if we start to shift that narrative and realize the impact while we're still here? And so that's sort of where the book comes from. It comes from the angle of story. It's not prescriptive or instructive. It's meant to allow people to see themselves in the stories, to relate to the circumstances or the situations, and then draw lessons from those stories. And so that's how the book came to be.
And you, I think I mentioned it earlier, you have this brilliant talk based on your own personal experience and what brought you to that pivotal moment that brought you to, we have to be thinking about what we do every day as part of our legacy. And Codi and I are colleagues in the professional speaking side of things. So tell us a bit more about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a consultant, a speaker, and an author. And interestingly, I guess the sort of the catch to all that is that my career actually started as a funeral director and embalmer, and I spent 20 years in that profession. And
fascinating history.
yeah, and when I talk about the lessons, so often I would see individuals whose lives were being celebrated, and I wasn't always quite sure that they realized the depth and breadth of their own impact. These beautiful testimonies, if you will, to people who were front and center, literally in caskets at the front of the room. And it was one funeral in particular that really helped to shape my impression of legacy. And it was for a gentleman, I would say like a grandfatherly like gentleman. And the words that were being used to describe him were powerful, kindness, loyal, loving, compassionate, supportive, like all these incredible characteristics with these deep, rich stories. There were tears from belly laughs, and there were tears from laughter, tears from sadness. It was a whole gamut of emotions. And I remember at one point thinking, holy smokes, I really hope this guy knew the depth of his impact on these people's lives. Because if this is the first time it's coming out of them, what a shame. And so that really helped me to reframe this idea of legacy. Of course, I'd heard the word. It was a word that was, around me my entire 20-year career, legacy, legacy, legacy. And I realized everything I had ever associated with the word was that legacy comes after, and that it's just something that's there. And so often I think we lose sight of this idea that we can actually impact our legacy. It's not a byproduct of who we are. It's actually something we are in control of. So we can be in control of the legacy we leave. That was my first thought about it. And then I thought, well, forget that. Why not realize the depth and breadth of our impact while we're still here? And so that's where the idea of everyday legacy sort of came from. And the lessons that I really drew from, a 20-year career staring death in the face is that, each one of those lessons really helps sort of shift or shape or solidify my perspective. And I thought, if it can do it for me, can it do it for other people who maybe have not had the closeness, if you will, to death every single day that I did for 20 years? And as it turns out, the book has been incredibly well received by so many people, including yourself. I'm so thankful for your support. And the message is really resonating. So I'm happily thankful for that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mentioned to Codi earlier before we started to record that I can't get enough of Codi's book. Like, I just keep ordering more copies of it and then keep, sending them to people because I think it's such a fantastic book. And I'm really glad that you talked about impact, because impact is significant. And that we do at times, as you said, you hear the word legacy all the time, and yet it can mean many different things to many different people. And then sometimes the word itself, because it's so often associated with death, can be intimidating for us. And people don't want to talk about it because they don't want to talk about their death. So as you said, you have a firsthand, upfront view of, you've seen it at the end. And I so appreciate that you want to bring it back to how we live our lives and what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was really careful, I think, for the very reasons you just identified, to be really conscious of how I constructed the book and the stories and the lessons, to not be macabre or dark. Certainly it explores the lessons from that career for the stories that are related to the funeral profession, but it does so in sort of, and hopefully you agree, in a sort of a light way to help people to understand that it's not to transform people's ideas around death. The truth is, especially in North America, we live in a really death averse society. People don't like to talk about their death, think about their death. They don't like to, it's a bit of a taboo subject. And so I knew if I was writing a book that drew lessons from that world, that I would have to lighten things up a little bit. And so the stories always come at it from that angle, right down to the cover of the book. I wanted it to be light and easy to look at, and not just scream death. Because it really isn't a book about death. It really is a book about life. And it really is a book about understanding the impact we can make on ourselves when we're conscious of it, and then those around us.
Yes, and if you look over Cody's shoulder, you can see, I was hoping I could have presented a copy of his book, but I only have the Kindle version now because I've given them all
You've given them all away. Yeah.
and I have 20 more coming. So, and probably much more, because I think this is such a key message for people to have, because if we can have the conversation now about what's important to us and who has impacted us and how they've impacted us, that will follow, that thread can be followed throughout our lives. And then that's the, beyond as well, sort of the time beyond our time here on Earth. Yeah. Codi, what sort of barriers, I'm not sure if I skipped a question, what has your experience been, given the theme is imagine your legacy, what has your experience been when, I know you've already touched on some of it, but anything else you want to add about that, and what you see as some of the challenges or barriers being for people to be thinking in terms of their legacy, in addition to the ones you've already mentioned about people's fear of death, and we have a challenge around the words we use and what we mean by it, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I think that, we live in a world right now that goes incredibly quickly, and I think we've realized in this microcosm of COVID-19, especially where we're so connected virtually, a lot of us had ample screen time. I'm being generous to those of us that have a lot of it before COVID-19. And then now that it's upon us, most of us are spending a lot of time even in these sort of virtual environments. And so the one thing that doesn't happen when we're going quickly is time for the pause, as I like to call it, time to sort of focus on what's important and who's important, and have really deep, meaningful conversations. And so one of the tools that I like to use to help people uncover what their everyday legacy is, if they're not entirely sure, is to have really purposeful conversations. Ask really careful questions that draw out what's really important to them. And again, oftentimes, the faster we go, it's twofold. One, people are not inclined to slow down. That's for the first piece of the puzzle. And the second piece of the puzzle is people are often not inclined to have these deep conversations. They want to have them, but they know that sometimes exploratory conversations lead to tough conversations or challenging conversations. And so I try to promote both of those. One, the pause, slow down, and two, invest in conversations that matter, essentially. Those are two really key things that can help us to really dial into, I always say what's important, but really when I say what, I mean who.
Yeah, excellent. And that's certainly been my experience. And I like that you added in there that they can be purposeful conversations, and that they're such important conversations for us to have, and for us to have with our friends and our family members. And I'm really hoping that your book and this series that we're going to be running will help to facilitate those conversations as well.
I hope so too.
Anything else? Let me see. What do we have? What about any other barriers or that we have to imagining our legacy and having these conversations?
Well, I think, if I had to give someone, one piece of advice that would help them to sort of understand this process or through the process of imagining their legacy, would be that there's one question that I like to use, and it's one that really helps people define their purpose very, very quickly. It helps those values and characteristics really rise to the top. Now, it's a tough question. It's one of those questions I prefaced in the previous answer. It's one of those hard questions, but I promise to people, you don't have to spend long there, because the values crystallize themselves like that. It's almost instant. And that question is, how do I want to be remembered? And so if we can flash forward almost to the, if you can flash forward to the end for just a brief moment, you're dead, your human experience is over. And you ask yourself, how do I want to be remembered? Those values are going to, like, like cream, they're going to rise very, very quickly. Things like, well, if tomorrow wasn't going to happen, these are the things I would want to be remembered for. I'd want to be remembered for kindness and compassion. I'd want to be remembered for being patient, being grateful, being loyal and loving. All of these things are going to rise up. Now, some people would have a laundry list of 12 or 20 or 40 things, but there are always, as I like to say, 3 or 4 or maybe 5 that are like the ones that if you had to give all the other ones away, you would hold on to until the last dying second. These are really important values. And I say that those are the things that we need to embed into our every single day, so that we're ultimately living our everyday legacy and in control of how ultimately we will be remembered. That's ultimately the one question I always say to ask.
That's wonderful. And and certainly for me, it is an evolving answer and response and the action that I take as a result of that. So certainly during COVID-19, I have found myself, like, the more I give, the more I want to give. And the more I learn about what's happening within charities, the more I want to be able to support them. And certainly just before I went to South Africa and updating my will, it just occurred to me, oh my gosh, like, I've been giving all my life, and I want to make sure that that my nieces and nephews can continue that legacy on as part of my legacy, because I want them to know that this is important to me. Giving back and supporting causes that are important to me, I want to pass on those values and that message. And you really have tapped into that. It's an ongoing conversation. It's ever evolving. So
well, I think you hit something on the head. I think, where your world of planning and my world as an author who wrote this book called Everyday Legacy, and sort of the union of the two is that, one of the things that, as I've suggested, is so important is having conversation. But I think so often when people think from a philanthropic perspective, they think very much from the angle of, I'll do this, but I shouldn't talk about it. I should do this, but I should be quiet about it. That whole idea of humility comes into play. But in fact, it's in its very essence. Talking about it helps other people align their values with the same sort of mission to give back and to offer something more on a long-term basis to charities who are in need. So I think that, the way that you've articulated it, sharing about it, that your passion to share about it is you living your everyday legacy. It's you showing up now to be in control of what people will eventually remember about you.
Thank you. And I also know that I feel like we can all do so much more in terms of helping charities do the heavy lifting. And that's part of the purpose around this series. And it's also because many younger families, and when I have the conversation, their main concern is their kids, which I understand. And that's their legacy right now. And so we have this book called 4 Little Pigs, where it teaches kids the importance of sharing what you have with others as well. So, and that too is an integrated part of our, I think, of our legacy as parents, as, aunts and uncles and godparents and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think to double down on that too, there could be people watching this that maybe don't have, a lot of money. They can't give necessarily right now. The great part is that you're planting the seed for when they can. But when they start to think about legacy in the context of our conversation being legacy today, what we can do is have conversations with others that is I like to call them like philanthropic conversations. And it actually has nothing to do with money. It has to do with the conversation like we just had. When I recognize someone for the strength or the greatness that they are, inevitably what happens is they start to recognize that themselves as being something that others value. And always, whenever that happens to us, when someone offers a kindness to us in terms of how we've impacted them, typically that deepens that behavior in us, that we want to spread that even more. We want that to show up more in our lives. Kindness is one thing, being the life of a party and always having creating a laugh for people. When someone says to you, look, like I admire so much that you can bring levity to a situation and lighten up a room. And I just love your sense of humor. it's so hilarious. And it makes me laugh every time. That person that hears that is obviously going to stay more present with those reactions in a moment in the future. And that's just one example. It's a silly example maybe, but
Great
kindness
example.
is another one. Compassion, when we hear that what we're doing, how we're showing up is impacting people positively, it deepens our connection with that, whatever that thing is. And so even if it's not money right now in the today, we inevitably can deepen even a philanthropic conversation about characteristics and values.
Absolutely. And when I first heard about your book, Codi, and you and I connected, we didn't really know each other that well. And we have had so many conversations. It's been very exciting as we both keep looking at opportunities to be able to share our passion and our excitement about this particular topic. So you're absolutely right. It's like we're planting seeds inside each other and they're growing, and then we're wanting to, plant more seeds and that sort of thing. So yeah. That's fantastic. Codi, in closing, is there anything else that you think it's important for people to keep in mind?
Yeah, I think when it comes to living your everyday legacy, one, we have to have the courageous conversation to at least consider that one question I offered, which is, how do you want to be remembered? Let all the feelings come up, let those values rise to the top, and then understand that those are likely the values that mean the most to you and the ones that you should try to embed and invest in every single day. And the other piece is that, it's really about small steps. It's not about giant, massive adjustments. It's about small shifts in how you show up in the world. One of the stories that I love to tell is one that is something that we do often. Now, maybe we don't do it as much in COVID-19, but it's grocery shopping. And I was standing in line at the grocery store, and the customer ahead of me was, I would say, clearly not having a good day. That's probably the kind way to put it. And I won't pass judgment because I don't know what their experience was that day, but their interaction with the store clerk was just really not super positive. And I could tell that it impacted the clerk. I was next up in line as my groceries ran down the conveyor belt, and I got to my interaction with them. It was definitely hampered. The person, clearly their spirits had been put down. And I thought, that person is out of earshot, so they won't see this as judgment. And, it's a long line behind me, probably 6 or 7 people. And I turned to the clerk and I said, wow, you handled jerks like a pro. And I smiled, and I saw the clerk sort of look up from what they were doing, and they looked up, and then just a smile beamed across their face. And they said, yeah, wow, that was not so fun. And I said, look, far be it from me to determine what was up in their world, but you really handled yourself really well, and you should be proud. And I'm just happy to see a smile back on your face. I could see you're really trying through that situation, and good for you. So other than that, how's your day going? And I could see this person's spirit just totally lift. And as I looked back in line, there were 6 or 7 more people waiting to go through the checkout. And I thought, you know what, that one tiny thing that I did, just that one tiny shift, adjusted that person in front of me, and consequently that will now impact the 6 or 7 people in line behind me. Because had I said nothing, had I just sort of stood there embarrassed for this person and swiped the credit card through and took my groceries and walked out, guaranteed in almost all likelihood, unless one of the 6 or 7 people behind me decided to change the state of that clerk, that person's day was completely impacted. So it's not about these grandiose things. I mean, ultimately, would I love to solve things like, homelessness and world hunger? Yes. And I can do things like that in my own unique way, in small impacts, donations, volunteering in soup kitchens, those sort of things. But it doesn't have to be even that grandiose. It can just be how we show up every single day in commonplace situations, and how we choose to interact with others and show up in the world powerfully. That to me is everyday legacy. That is putting those values on repeat, and then deepening our experience and the experience of others in our lives to really understand the impact we're making, and to put those honestly, to put those values on autopilot and just have them be ever present in our life in such a deeply impactful way. To me, that's everyday legacy.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Thank you so much, Codi. And I look forward to when we have our webinar. And I our next guest will be Jackie Handy, who is from England, and she's also a professional speaker. And she has come up with this really creative idea around linking businesses with charities, which is why she's representing the Imagine Your Legacy. Codi is addressing Imagine Your Legacy today, and she will be tomorrow because she's making these linkages with charities and businesses for what can happen tomorrow. And then Heather Austin Scarrett, who is a lawyer who, as I was saying to Codi, she has her own story about her grandmother, which is fantastic. She'll be talking about beyond, because people have questions about, you know, wills and powers of attorney, and she'll do it in a really fascinating, interesting, and practical way. So I thank you so much, Codi, for being a part of this, and appreciate your time. And yeah, that's great.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Betty Ann, and I look forward to the webinars and to continuing the conversation with people even beyond the screen. You know, people can find me on social media at Codi Shewan, CODISHEWAN, or at everydaylegacy.com. Because I really think the conversations that follow these sort of conversations are the ones that deepen people's awareness and impact even more. So I look forward to connecting with whoever sees this and continuing that conversation.
Absolutely. And this is so exciting. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks.